In short, there are grounds for optimism. There are limits to the amount of quality shallow water sites that are going to be available in maturing markets. Although bottom fixed is going to continue in the short to mid-term, longer term growth is going to come in floating wind. To do that, you need to, people are starting now. They're doing the demonstration projects, they're building up scale, and there are now auctions for commercial size wind farms out there. So if we look at the things that are going to drive floating wind activity, and it's the activity, a lot of it needs to be done this decade, but you'll see it grid commissioned in the next decade, because these projects have very long gestation periods. They're 4 to 5 years offshore for a commercial wind farm. So these are long projects, but you need to start well ahead of time. So the 4 key points that builds on the confidence in the long-term pipeline, and we really address this in a current report that we've just released on the floating offshore wind vessel forecast, looking at what drives that through up to 2035, actually. It's auctions and auctions awarded. And auctions, so that means space offshore has been awarded to developers to say, you can assess these sites and develop offshore wind on these sites. And that's happened in Europe, it's happened in North America, and it's happening now in Asia. So that creates the inventory for the developers. They need to get that power to shore, so that's really grid connections. Now, today, the grid infrastructure was not built for wind farms offshore in remote locations. Today's grid infrastructure was built near onshore power plants that are near population centers. So we need to get that power from offshore to an onshore connection into the grid, and that needs investment, and that's been identified and it's ongoing. It's not one of those today activities. That's something that's happening through this decade and into next decade, and that's driving a lot of supply chain activity in factories onshore, in vessels, in ports, that whole supply chain. The developers, they need certainty of revenue. They need an offtake mechanism. They need to sell it to somebody, and they need some form of revenue protection. And this is recognizing that floating offshore wind costs are higher than bottom fixed wind costs, especially at the beginning. And just as in bottom fixed wind, governments are required to subsidize and fund the technology and create the conditions for growth to allow it to accelerate, and that drives down the supply chain costs. We're not there in floating wind yet because we just don't have the scale. But those offtakes and that revenue protection is starting. It's already been awarded this year on some projects, and there are others that are being identified and announced. So that's something that is going to roll through over the next few years. There'll be awards of those revenue protection or offtake mechanisms. That means that the developer has a route to market. Then he can take their, or the developer, the developer can take their investment decision to build a wind farm. And that's really what the supply chain needs. So at the moment, we're getting it in small scale, and the supply chain, leveraging the existing oil and gas and offshore construction supply chains, can deal with the demonstration and small scale projects. But to reach that commercial scale projects where the activity is really required towards the end of this decade into the next decade, those signals need to be sent now to the supply chain. There need to be the agreement. So this is where there has to be the collaboration with the developers, with the government agencies and the supply chain to allow the investments to be made in the factory capacities and capabilities, and also in the vessels. Because one thing we're going to talk about is that there is a shortage of vessels. The main construction vessels are going to be anchor handlers and big anchor handlers and big subsea vessels. And there is a relatively limited supply of these vessels. The subsea vessels in particular are very busy. The anchor handlers have got pretty good utilization and recovering utilization. But once we start looking at the volumes required in a floating wind farm of the station keeping systems, things that would be similar to the oil and gas industry, something to hold station, an anchor point of some variety, a mooring line of some variety, but lots of them. and that needs lots of repetitive activity of the anchor handling and subsea work. The inter-array cables, which are these dynamic flexible cables to connect each of the turbines effectively into the substation to transport the power. These are all the core technologies of floating wind, and that really requires anchor handlers and subsea vessels, but it requires the biggest of them. And our forecasts of that, when you look at the forecasts of the activity required, coupled with that of the oil and gas activity, is we are going to start to see shortages in the vessel supply, irrespective of the scenario of floating wind development, because there are different technologies that can be deployed. Shortages starting towards the end of this decade. And to fill those shortages, that means vessels need to be built to fill that gap. That takes time to build those vessels. As shipyards are beginning to they're either getting busy at the moment, or they've lost the skills to build these big anchor handlers, because no big anchor handlers have been built for quite some time. The equipment that feeds them, the winches, the handling systems, all of those haven't been built at that scale. They've been built for smaller systems for some time. So all of that stuff needs to be built up at scale again, and that takes time, and that takes the confidence for a ship owner to invest. Now, we're seeing ship owners invest in subsea vessels because the general subsea vessel segment is relatively buoyant and they can see pretty good utilization in that. Can't really see the same story coming out from the anchor handling market, because in the floating wind side, these vessels may only be used for half a year, let's say, in a worst case per year, because of weather windows. They might, in a good year, there might be up to 9 months or something like that, but they're not going to be used 365. And vessel owners need that utilization, and that needs, again, to bring in the developers, needs to bring in the agencies, and that's where you need the volume of not just one project, but you need multiple projects where people know the vessel can go from project to project. But quite simply, to build what has been auctioned, what is being discussed as offtakes and revenue protection and grid connections, means we are short of vessels, and we're going to be short of the crews for those vessels. So if we look at the offshore space, obviously offshore oil and gas had a pretty bad few years after 2014. Lost a lot of vessels, lost a lot of rigs, lost a lot of activity. And it is that activity that the crews build up their man hours in undertaking specific operations, dynamic positioning, deep water anchor handling, deep water operations. So, for instance, if your semi-sub fleet drops by a half, you're likely to be doing at least half the anchor handling. Now, when we roll into floating wind, you're going to see a lot more anchors involved in a project. A commercial project might have a minimum 180 anchors on it, whereas a commercial deep water floating production project might have 16 to 24 anchors. The volume of anchors is significantly more, so the number of anchor handling moves is more. So you need people with the man hours to do that, to be on the vessels, and especially as owners will want, or developers will want to see senior crew members with the right numbers of logged man hours, not in simulators, but actually doing the work as well. And quite simply, at the moment, we don't have that work base. So we're going to get a situation where there's loss of skill in the industry anyway. There's a natural aging in the industry, a challenge to recruit and retain what we have. There are then going to be more vessels coming in that are then going to require the crewing, and there will be competition from other trades for dynamic positioning officers, qualified seafarers, which makes it a bit of a perfect storm to say we need the signals to the crewing side that it is safe to recruit and start to train people. For that, the owners need to have the certainty that their vessels will be utilized. For that, they need the developers involved to give them the certainty of charters, and that needs then the governments on board, or the agencies on board, to give that long-term surety of demand. So there are still some challenges to address, but there are very big challenges, and Again, because it takes time to build these competencies and skills, those efforts need to start sooner than later. It's a comprehensive bottom-up look at the drivers for floating wind activity from now through 2035. That involves looking at a global view of activity, what's going on in each market, and detailed country profiles, case studies of what's actually being built and what's actually in permitting now, a lot of peer review documentation, a quite detailed analysis of the technical drivers for vessels, what to identify what are going to be the differences between traditional oil and gas work and floating wind. And that generally comes with the volume of components and the scale of those components. They're physically very big components. So creating the basis for understanding why we come up with forecast solutions for different station keeping solutions, because floating wind, what people who are familiar with the subject will maybe understand, is there is no one winning technology at the moment. There are effectively three core technologies to hold the turbine and multiple options to keep station of that floating structure. What we've boiled that down into is some scenarios that effectively give you an upper and a lower and a mid case based on different types of mooring scenarios and structure scenarios, and built that out through 2035. Again, but backed up by detailed review of planning documents and activity of what's being done. So that translates to activity forecast in turbines, in mooring systems, in inter-array cables, into vessel demand and vessel demand scenarios. Looking at what's going on in the oil and gas activity as well, in the drilling and production side, and the use of anchor handlers and subsea vessels, bringing that factor into it, plus the aging anchor handler fleet into a supply model. So bringing supply and demand together to then come up with scenarios and our view of what the supply demand balance will look like going through to 2035. That then allows us to drive the views on the crewing requirements as well. So it's a pretty comprehensive document that's up to date, latest peer review and interaction with industry and combination of our own experiences, laying it out with people to explain all the various challenges along the supply chain. And that will be useful for developers. It'll be useful for government agencies. It'll be useful for banks and insurance companies, as well as the supply chain, the people who will build, operate, own these vessels, the people who will use these vessels, and the component makers who make the components which these vessels will install. So there's a lot of information of use for a lot of people.